My name's Sharon Hartle. I'm from the University of Verona, and I'm going to be talking today about transforming the blend. Before the pandemic, when I first proposed this to Iatefl, my focus was on adapting materials for blended learning, but now it's slightly wider. It's a more holistic view of learning design, which is increasingly being talked about, and learning design puts the learner at the centre of the design process. So let's have a look at what that means. I'm going to talk today about blended learning now, the state of the art, where are we? Quickly. I want to look at what's changing with materials, tools, activities, how these can be adapted for use in class, with examples from our University Language Centre, and also a very simple framework for learning design, materials adaptation and implementation that can be used in local contexts. So, blended learning, state of the art, emergency remote teaching or blended learning. We've heard a lot about emergency remote teaching. We all know what it is, and this picture just about illustrates it. Well, it encapsulates it, I think, completely. This could be a learner, could be a teacher, but it's not a positive image. It's negative. There's an idea of stress, and this has been coming out in the conference. I heard yesterday people talking about being thrown into online learning, being distance teaching, it being forced onto us. These are all very negative views of distance teaching, and this characterizes ERT. Two things in particular that characterize ERT, emergency remote teaching, are a lack of planning. We just had to make the most of the situation and do what we could. So lack of planning or principled didactic delivery. And ERT is a reactive, it's a response to the crisis. It's not an approach or a delivery method that people have chosen. However, is there anything positive about this? Well, it has also been defined as a quintessential adaptive and transformative challenge. And going forward, this transformative is something that I want to focus on. How can we take the lessons from ERT and transform the way we teach in the future? Blended learning has a totally different evolution. Originally, perhaps the focus was on the combination of face-to-face physical instruction and the computer, digital resources. This was in 2006, and it was computer mediated, so face-to-face context, computer. Later, this shifted to the range of possibilities that emerge from combining the internet, combining digital media with the established classroom work that people do, which require the physical co-presence, which I think is important too. So it's the same, but the focus is slightly different. It's looking at not so much the space as being two different things, but how the two coming together can create learning. What's emerging from a little study that we're doing in Verona that I think is worth mentioning is that both teachers and learners tend to stress two main aspects that are lacking in ERT, or that they need, or that they think is important in learning. And these are socialization, the human dimension, interaction, and also a need for effective resources for independent study. So they need the synchronous working together, having actual contact with people, but also opportunities for independent study asynchronously. So let's have a look then at materials, activities, tools, and how they're changing. So just type into the chat box what comes to mind when I say to you ELT materials. You have maximum 30 seconds for this. Yeah? We're getting things like books, worksheets, videos. All these things could be materials. But where is the line? Where is the border between materials, activities and tools nowadays with the digital resources that we have? This is an image of materials which I would like to return to. Tomlinson defined materials, ELT materials, as products or objects that facilitate learning, which is quite a broad, in fact, it's a very broad definition, and he said a lot more about it, but this is something that's been widely cited, and it's worth thinking about. Products or objects that facilitate learning. They could be a whole range of things. They could be perhaps what we think of traditionally as materials, or they could be tools as well, technological devices, pens, paper, and also behaviour, interactions and activities, discussions, websites. All these things facilitate learning, and they're products. A product may be an idea. So the border between materials, tools and activities is becoming increasingly blurred, which is why, to return to this idea that I have in the background picture of materials as being the raw content that goes together to create something. These are materials that could make clothes, they could make furnishings. Our materials create a learning experience and can be built on. So, key questions I think to ask when thinking about the use of materials and activities: what are my aims as a teacher for these materials activities? What do my learners want or need to do? What do they already know? And what is the best way from them to get from A to B? This has not changed. This has always been what we would think about when looking at materials, but what has changed is the context. So when using materials online, the digital aspect, which is the new one, if you like, we have to think about the affordances of the technology. What is the best way to use those materials? And it's not just to transfer the face-to-face classroom activities online. Here, just to give you an idea, are some of the unsuccessful uses of online context for materials. For example, slides or materials with no instructions how to use them. These may seem like common sense, but they're things that are quite common, and from the point of view of the learner, these are things that get in the way, that actually obstruct learning. So if you have no instructions, you might find out how to use them, but it would be easier if you had instructions of what to do. A learning path. Providing too much, an over-enthusiastic use of resources. Teachers preparing lessons see lots of lovely resources. There's so much available these days, and become over-enthusiastic. And this can lead to cognitive overload. Too much. How do I deal with it? What do? I can't do all this. Exercises that are intended for autonomous study, but no answers are provided. There's nothing worse if you're a student than not having the answers to the exercise that's being given to you. Resources being used because of the wow factor. You may love a particular tool, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your learners do, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best tool for what they need to be able to do. Again, quizzes with no useful feedback. This is a bit like the exercises. Feedback is essential for learners who are working independently. And this ego-focused feedback, like try again or well done, is not perceived as being the most useful. Our learners perceive feedback that tells them where they've made mistakes as being the most useful, because you don't need a pat on the back. You need to be told, where did I go wrong? But this is in my context. It may be different in other contexts. My context is a university context. Okay, so the implications of this are, as I said before, it's really important, I think, to think about the affordances of the medium, what's important for that medium. If somebody is working alone, you need to provide more information, perhaps. And to think about the needs of the learner. Again, putting the learner at the centre of the process. So here's an example of learner images and how I use them. This is a way of, I think, taking advantage of the affordances of Linoit. Linoit, I'm sure a lot of people know, is a site for, it's like a digital notice board. You can put up stickies, you can put up photos and links, but that's about as far as it goes. You can comment on the photos as well. So here, this is a getting to know you activity, and it has my activities and learners' activities, and it's a matching game. They put photos of a corner of their house, or a personal object or something. No, I think it was a corner of their house, and wrote little texts. I then mixed them up, and they independently had to match them. And then when they came into the classroom, they saw if they'd managed to match them to the correct pictures, and the person who wrote the text talked more about it. So this is a way of using the affordances of flipping content, of having people working online, motivating them, bringing their context into the classroom, but then also extending the activity that's been done independently into the face-to-face context. Of course, in my context with adults, it's quite appropriate for them to share their photos. This may not be the same in your context. So bringing the personal world into class, it makes learning more relevant and specific for the learner, but it depends, as always, on your context and your learners. This activity, the unicorn, is one that in my teaching has undergone an amazing transformation. So I just wanted to show this to you, to show how an activity over the years has transformed. It began life as a creative dictation. So a creative dictation where the learner doesn't write down everything that the teacher says, but I dictate the first line. One day a man woke up and looked out of the window, and the learners wrote down, answered the question, describe the man. Okay, now I could simply, nowadays, I could just do this in the chat. So I'm going to ask you to do this. So, one day a man woke up and looked out of the window. Describe the man. You have 1 minute to describe the man in the chat box. Okay, we have some lovely descriptions coming in here. Yeah, okay, so what I'm doing here is already different to the traditional one. What is different is that we can all see what everybody else is writing. So we have access to what the learner is producing immediately. And this could lead, so we're actually doing listening, writing, and reading skills all at the same time. So this is an affordance of the technology, and we could take it further. We could ask people to ask each other questions. There are all kinds of things that we could do with this online, but originally this was done in the classroom. So then it had to be put up on the wall, people walked around. Movement is also good. It's not that one is better than the other, it's that they're different. Okay, so this was an activity, digital storytelling, that I first came across from Morgan and Rimbalukri in 1983. And if you want to know more about the unicorn, then go to that activity. It's Once Upon a Time. It was actually adapted for Language Lab. So it was already, they adapted this activity of creative dictation for Language Labs then. And the teacher dictated, just as I did with you. And at this point, the learners recorded their voice. So we have a different skill. It's spoken language. In the 1990s, we took this and we put it into resource centres, so it went onto computers. This allowed an element of choice. So it was still the teacher reading and dictating, but at this point the learner could choose whether to write or whether to listen. And again, it wasn't immediately available the way it was now when we just did it, but it was there, and learners could change place, they could move around the resource centre, they could listen to each other's, and they could work in groups and build on it, do a whole range of things. But at this stage, questions are emerging, at least for me, and these questions are: who chooses the skill? Who chooses the timetable? Who chooses the skill? It was originally the teacher, but as we go forward, more choice is provided for the learner. And this is one of the big affordances of technology. It allows more interaction by the learner, more choice. Who chooses the timetable? Well, this at that time was depended on the institution, when people had time to go into the language lab, or when you organised when it was available and you went and you could do it. So the timetable was not completely free. And it also depended on what facilities were available, because not all schools had language labs, not all schools had resource centres. Later on, I adapted this and used it on VoiceThread. I don't know if you know VoiceThread, but it gives you the chance to create a video, and learners can then either write comments or they can record their voices. So this looked like this. This is me looking rather surprised, and I'm dictating this, and you can see that here there are comments from the learners. So this is a written and this is an oral one. This provides independent access, so a learner can access it when they want. The timetable is really up to them, as long as they have the internet, which is a big as long as. Not everybody does, but if they do, then they can. It gives them the choice of writing or speaking, and easy access to learner-generated content. As we saw at the beginning with our activity, you can see what other people have written, and you can do things with that. You can integrate it into your teaching learning process. The latest evolution of this is on Padlet, and this provides even more choice. Further integration of content. As you can see, the learners sometimes read and the learners sometimes listen. They hear me dictating it or they read. So we're integrating more skills. They can choose whether to write or whether to record their voices, or even to provide their own videos. And what's more, they can actually grade or like. I didn't put like, I put star. They can actually star each other's contributions. So we have a kind of assessment element that is appearing here as well. So this was the evolution of the unicorn. I just want to show one other example, and it's connected to teaching memorable events. So I said that I believe it's very important to put the learner at the centre of learning design, and this was teaching a group of upper intermediate university students how to talk about the past. Upper intermediate, okay? So this particular activity, where we are looking again at the affordances of technology and what we can do, this was done in the classroom, so it was blended. We had the physical classroom and the online class. So, but we're using technology in the physical classroom as well as using physicality online. Well, not physicality, but interaction online. So the learners had thought about how to talk about memorable events in the past. And one of the differences from Linoit is here we're using, but we're not publishing learner images, because you may not want to do that. So they're only using their own learner images during the lesson. So here is an image of me, and this is a mobile device image. Learners have a wealth of content on their devices these days. And they can bring that in. Again, we're bringing the personal dimension into the classroom and combining those two. So what they had to do was they had to ask questions about this memorable moment, like where I was, why it was memorable, what had happened before, what happened after, what that strange little thing is at the top on the left, whatever they wanted to. Okay, so we're bringing the personal dimension into the classroom to practice language in a natural way, and we're also using the technology. So the machine itself, the telephone, becomes a participant, which enables seamless integration of the classroom with the personal world and natural language use at the same time. So to come to the framework, this is a very simple framework based on 4 questions: why, what, how and who, but I think it can be a useful way to approach adapting materials for online use. If we start with the why, the first thing is to identify outcomes, and I'm going to illustrate this with this lesson that we've just seen the practice activity for, the one about memorable past moments. So if I want to identify my overall aim, then it was to enable learners to discuss memorable moments in the past. The learning stages, or the what of this, which is clearly tied up with the who. It's a cycle, it's not a linear process. The who is in fact everywhere. So the stages, I asked myself, what do my learners need to know? And here we have the things that they need to know. So these. Looking at the how, then, as we've been saying, look at the affordances of the context. And I've been focusing on the technological, the digital, because that's what's the newer context. But actually, blended learning means looking at both contexts. It's not that one is more important than the other. So it means looking at what can be done interactively, what is useful to do interactively, and what can be done independently or can be provided for autonomous access. So the face-to-face, things like practice, feedback, sharing, clarifying, etc. Independent are study, writing, reflecting. There is some overlap in this. And both, reviewing language points or lectures. These are just examples of things that can be done in these two contexts, but it's very much worth considering the affordances of both the physical space and the online space. As I said, the learner, the who, is everywhere. And this is an image that's often shown when talking about fair assessment. Is it really fair to ask both the fish and the monkey to climb a tree? Obviously not. The same activity does not test everyone in the same way. The learner is an essential part. And this is just as true of effective learning strategies. So our learners are not just wooden shapes that fit into a slot. A learner-centered approach takes account of what is relevant to the learner, the context of that learner, the learner's motivations, why are they there, social interaction, provides social interaction, and inclusion. So to extend this discussion, I've created a Padlet, and I'll put the link for this into the chat box. I don't know if I can show it to you. No, I don't think I can, but it's just a space where I might be able to show you in a minute, where we'll be able to extend this discussion. You can look at it if you want to. It would be really nice, because I'd really like to know what other people are doing with their materials. And if anybody wants to contact me, that would be great, because as I said, we are actually studying these things at the University of Verona. So, learner comments on this. I wanted to focus particularly on the yellow one. If technology is used in an effective way, it helps me focus more and find the class more interesting. Effective use of technology means not simply putting notes up on PowerPoint, but using these tools as support and to help students. This was in the university context, but it does underline this need for the activities that we choose to be effective and to be appropriate for the learning aims of that particular student. So, conclusion. ERT is not BL. Blended learning is proactive, it's not reactive. It's no longer perhaps the dichotomy of the physical and the computer mediated, but focuses more on social interaction and independent study and how these two can be blended. The most effective use, for example, of spaces, tools, activities and materials, thinking of the affordances of the context is key. And the why, what, how, who framework can help you to do this. My whole point was that learning design should be a learner-centered design, and what this means ultimately, I think, is providing more choice for learners, including the elephant, the monkey and the fish. So here are a few references from this talk. I don't know if the slides will be made available, but they probably will. So thanks for listening and goodbye from Verona. So we can now move on to questions if anybody has any questions.